Hello, Connecting Point. Welcome back to our series in the book of Revelation. We're coming towards the end of the book. And as we begin this week, I wanted to pick up one of the threads that Doug talked about last week about how Jesus, in this image that we're given of him as the white, or the horseman on the white horse, the rider, he has this name that is knowable only to himself. And Doug's suggestion was that this is because God is inexhaustible in what we can know about him, because he's infinite and we're not. There's this one of those distinguishing characteristics that God has that makes him different than his created beings. So I was thinking about this week, and this truth that a finite mind like yours and mine can't understand the infinite nature of God has me thinking about the whole of Revelation and how John is pulling back the curtain on the spiritual reality that's underpinning our day-to-day lives experiences, but then how John ends up relating this reality to his readers or hearers in this densely crafted, artistic, symbolic language, rather than in, like straightforward prose, as it were. So why is it that John is using this kind of language? And we're going to see the same thing happening again in our text this week as John continues to let us in on the final result of all that he's been talking about, all that we've been seeing throughout the book of Revelation. And so we're going to look at two images, particularly that he's hinted at, the throne, but then more specifically the bride. And it's interesting to me that these are still not going to be spoken of in plain language. We're going to be continuing to see this mixing and remixing of biblical ideas and metaphors, and hopefully we'll gain some more clarity about what he's meaning by all of this. So before we get into the text this week, I wanted to frame our discussion by taking a moment to think about a poem. Eugene Peterson wrote this book on the parables, which he titled Tell It Slant, which he named after what I think is the best Emily Dickinson poem. So here's the Emily Dickinson poem. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant, success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise, as lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. I think this is a really valuable insight into what is going on when John is trying to pull back the curtain to reveal the truth of the eschatological truth, the spiritual truth of the world. I was thinking about that even in like a more mundane context. So here's my example is this week, it was my wife's birthday. And on these birthdays, we use these occasions to try to do something loving and good and to help these people who are important to us know what they mean to us. And I was thinking about the pressure that the birthday brings and how that, on me, right? Which is not something that's necessarily fair. It's not even communicated by her towards me, but to meet the occasion with a suitable symbol, present, or a card, or whatever. And I was thinking about all the different little ways that I tell my wife that I love her, slant, right? And things like, she's asked me lately to be smiling more at her, so I've been trying to do that. Saying the words "I love you" on a pretty regular basis, that's been a staple of our married life, but it doesn't get at the truth. It's a bit of a slanted way to tell the truth. Present, smile, and statements don't really get at the issue of what it is to be married to someone, to devote yourself to them in a completely unique way amongst all human relationships. It's its own thing, right? There's an intensity to love, and I think actually to any of the other real virtues or fruits of the Spirit, that is a little like the capital T truth that Dickinson is talking about. You kind of have to tell them slant, partly because you can't handle the fullness of your own expression. We can't say it all in one perfectly crafted sentence. You have to show it through practice, through behavior. You show love, or you show faithfulness or self-control or whatever through what you dwell upon in your mind, right? It's a habit. It's why Moses gives us this instruction in Deuteronomy to put the law of the Lord on our wrists and on our heads, symbolizing this as a symbol we've explored actually quite a bit through Revelation, symbolizing what we do and what we're thinking about, right? Truth needs to be definitional. You can't just say it all at once and then there it is for all times, right? The old joke about the husband who's like, well, I told you I loved you on our wedding day, and if anything changes, I'll let you know. That's ridiculous. Even Jesus doesn't say it all at once to us. He says something more interesting like, I am the way, the truth, and the life, or I am the bread of life, or come to me and you will drink from streams of living water that will never go dry. Like, what are these things getting at? Well, he's doing this circuitous, slantwise telling of the truth. This warrants our meditation. John's images that he's been sharing with us as we've read through the book of Revelation warrant our meditation as John is slantwise telling us the truth. So, our first table talk is that I want you to think about what are some of the slant images that you can recall from our study of Revelation. Okay, let's get into our text. We're reading from Revelation 21, and I'm reading out of the New English Translation this week. And then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and earth had ceased to exist, and the sea existed no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, made ready like a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, the residence of God is among human beings. He will live among them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death will not exist anymore, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the former things have ceased to exist. And the one seated on the throne said, Look, I am making all things new. And then he said to me, Write it down, because these words are reliable and true. He also said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the one who is thirsty I will give water free of charge from the spring of the water of life. The one who conquers will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowards, unbelievers, detestable persons, murderers, the sexually immoral, and those who practice magic spells, idol worshippers, and all those who lie, their place will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur. That is the second death. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 final plagues came and spoke to me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. So he took me away in the Spirit to a huge, majestic mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. The city possesses the glory of God. Its brilliance is like a precious jewel, like a stone of crystal clear jasper. It has a massive, high wall with 12 gates, with 12 angels at the gates, and the names of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel are written on the gates. There are 3 gates on the east side, 3 gates on the north side, 3 gates on the south side, and 3 gates on the west side. The wall of the city has 12 foundations, and on them are the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The angel who spoke to me had a golden measuring rod with which to measure the city and its foundation stones and wall. Now the city is laid out as a square, its length and width the same. He measured the city with the measuring rod at 1,400 miles. Its length and width and height are equal. He also measured its wall, 144 cubits according to human measurement, which is also the angels. The city's wall is made of jasper, and the city is pure gold, like transparent glass. The foundations of the city's wall are decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation is jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates are 12 pearls. Each one of the gates is made from just one pearl. The main street of the city is pure gold like transparent glass. Now I saw no temple in the city, because the Lord God, the all-powerful, and the Lamb are its temple. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, because the glory of God lights it up, and its lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their grandeur into it. Its gates will never be closed during the day, and there will be no night there. They will bring the grandeur and the wealth of the nations into it, but nothing ritually unclean will ever enter into it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or practices falsehood, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. All right. So once again, we're going to need to think about the stacking of the images from the Old Testament that John is using to express the truth here. We're getting towards a final picture now of what John wrote about in the marvelous prologue part of his gospel, the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us. In this chapter and in chapter 22, as he lays out these final plans and purposes for creation, we already saw that in the last chapter, the elements, or the earth and the sky, or the material universe, and then Doug also described it as the ideologies, all fled from the presence of God, who is fully unveiling himself now in this final throne room judgment when Satan and all the enemies of God are thrown into the lake of fire. And so what we have is this carte blanche that's made. All the ideologies are gone, all the material universe gets refashioned in some way, because the evil human manipulations and systems, the evil work of the Satan and the other angels that have walked away from God, or whatever it is that they do, however they move, that they've turned their back on God at any rate. These groups, these people, all the systems that are made by these entities are overthrown and judged for their sinful deficiency. But what we don't see in that moment is that all of humankind is then judged and thrown into the lake of fire en masse, even though that's kind of what we deserve. Faithful humanity is on victory parade, which is what we saw back in chapter 19. Jesus, who we call the bridegroom, is riding at the head of a victorious column, but the column is also a wedding ceremony, right? And he is upon a white horse and then judging and conquering by his powerful word. The faithful to him, his bride, are following in his train, not wearing armor and wielding weapons, but rather they're dressed in white linen, a terrible battle garment. But it's representing the righteousness that he has imparted to us through his death on the cross, through his resurrection from the grave. And as Doug described it last week, this is one of the strangest pictures that you'll come across of a victorious army. But the victory is won through, C.S. Lewis might have called it the deeper magic, if you were going to use the Narnia phrase for it, right? So I want you to put a pin in the idea of the bridegroom and the bride, because I'm wanting to come back to that as we get towards the end of our text this week. The first thing that I want you to see in our chapter this week, though, is that it mirrors the story of Exodus quite a bit, where we see a sequence where plague and judgment is followed by the description of the creation of the place for God to live, the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. And so we kind of get the plague sequences, the escape from Egypt, and then it slows down, and we take a lot of time in the rest of the book of Exodus to build a tabernacle where God is going to dwell amongst the people of Israel. Later on in Solomon's time, we see the tabernacle is kind of made more permanent into a temple in Jerusalem, which will sit at the center of the city, or in the tabernacle times at the center of their camp, right? And this is very symbolic, this picture, how the temple or the tabernacle being centered in the middle of their city or their camp shows that the whole culture of the Hebrews, their whole civilization, and therefore each one of their own individual lives was supposed to be oriented around this relationship to the spiritual reality, to relationship with Yahweh, and then identity as one of his chosen people. John described Jesus' incarnation as the Word becoming flesh and making a tabernacling with humans on earth. John would have been a very first-hand witness to this, as someone who traveled with Jesus, who ate with Jesus. Probably they shared quarters at times. Now we have, instead of God doing this in an individual man, in the presence of an individual man, he's going to do this for all of humankind as he creates a new tabernacle, a heavenly tabernacle in some sense, a city though, a new Jerusalem, which descends out of heaven. And what we see is that God's space and our space start to completely overlap. Of significance, we don't build up to it like the Tower of Babel. God sends it down to us, brings it down to us, he gives it to us, yet another gift of his love and grace and the peace that he seeks with humankind. So let's take a few moments to look at the different symbols that John uses in describing the city. Darrell Johnson in his commentary helpfully breaks this into two groups of 7 things. One group of the things that are absent, and one group of things that are present. So we'll start with the absences. So what do we not see there? First of all, we don't see the sea anymore. So the sea, of course, in the Old Testament represents chaos, the striving of the nations. It represents the unknown. And we've already seen this a little bit in like the throne room sequences in Revelation, where the sea is a sea of glass, meaning you can walk upon it. It's no longer going to swallow you. Or you can think about as well Jesus' mastery over the wind and the waves, where he walks upon the water, or where he stands in the boat and tells the waves to just calm down and be still. God's mastery over the chaos, right? Then we see no tears, death, mourning, crying, or pain. So these are the things, of course, that define our lives in a lot of ways in this sinful, shortcoming world. And they are no longer. They're no longer going to exist in this new Jerusalem, and we're freed to fully live into God's purposes for us without the hindrances of the traumas that hit all of us, right? Coupled with that, though, is that we see that evil characteristics are also banished, right? So we have this list: cowards, detestable persons, murderers, people who practice sexual immorality, practitioners of magic. And remember, that's people who worship the workings of their hands, or who seek to become gods, little g gods in some ways, right? Idolaters, liars, they've taken their place with their god, Satan, in the lake of fire. Then we get this description how there's no temple. That's kind of strange, isn't it? That was like a key feature of kind of the Hebrew imagination, is that the temple is actually the center of the city, and they yearn for the return of the temple. Wouldn't you think a temple would be a key feature of a heavenly city? What we see here, though, is that the city is a massive cube. Now, the size of it is approximately as big as the Roman Empire, the 1,400 miles in length and breadth. But then we also have it a vertical city as well, which is a bit of a strange notion. I can't even imagine what a vertical city would look like. Maybe it's like Hong Kong, but then like blown out to incredible proportions. I'm not sure. And it's built out of these materials that are reflective of God's glory in this spectacular way. We have this gold and all these jewels and whatnot that are named. Now, the cubic reference, though, is significant. It's a reference to the Holy of Holies that was built in the temple. That was shaped as a perfect cubic formation. So that microcosm of the Holy of Holies, where God's presence would dwell, has now blown out and become the whole cosmos of God's great city. The temple, which was needed to focus our attention on the overlap of that space, is unnecessary, because now we live within that overlap of our space and God's space. We live within the Holy of Holies in this description. And so because of this, because God's presence is there, there's no need for a sun or a moon. It's not necessarily that these are gone, although we saw that they were wiped away in one of the descriptions earlier in the text. But there's no need for a sun or moon anymore. The light who emanates from the one who made and continues to make light will be sufficient for all of our needs. The gates are there. There's 12 gates, one open to each side, or 3 open to each side of the compass point, showing that it's open to people from all directions, spaces, places in the universe, in the world. But they're not closed. So what do the gates do? Well, they keep out unwanted people, or they keep in prisoners. But neither of these things exist anymore, because the people who are unwanted have been dealt with, and the people who are there are free. They're not prisoners. Notice that these gates and foundations that we have named in this spot are also scriptural reference points, the 12 disciples of Jesus and the 12 tribes of Israel. The whole enterprise of living the life of faith is built upon the experiences shown us in the Old and New Testaments, and this is evident in the naming of these gates and these foundations. Finally, we have no curse. So the temporary measures that we use in these days to wrestle with the curse, right? The notion of sacrifice, or then now the notion of sacrament, maybe, where we honor Jesus' sacrifice through the sacraments, through baptism and communion and some of the other stuff that we do. These methods of mediating our sinfulness and of finding absolution for that sin are now not necessary. God's removed the curse from us, and now we are living properly, freely, and properly within His will. So what is there in this heavenly city? We're going to look at 7 things, but I'm only going to mention the last 2 because we see them much more in chapter 22. So the first thing that we should notice is that God is there, obviously. But we shouldn't skate past this. In one of the earlier messages on the throne room, we noticed that John wasn't looking directly at the throne of heaven because it was still a little too glorious. He was just kind of noticing someone was there. But then he also did see the Lamb of God in the middle of the throne, at the center of the throne, this 7-horned perfect sacrifice who had been slain but was also living, Jesus, right? And now as we're finding out as we look at this whole scene of glory, that Jesus really is the one who is standing at the center of everything. That image, the Lamb, that image of the conqueror with the sword coming out of his mouth, that is what we worship. That is God. That is the source of glory. There's no more need to veil. The telling at slant can begin to diminish as we become fully cleansed to experience God's purity and holiness, but we're never going to fully know God. So if God is there, then of course we're also going to be in the presence of His glory. It's going to be staggering or blinding even, right? John is noticing how overwhelming it is in the language. It's heavy. So the notion of glory or blessedness in Hebrew is a term for heaviness or weightiness. C.S. Lewis, in his very thought-provoking, it's kind of a novel, about the afterlife, it's called The Great Divorce, he envisions the glory of God as meaning that one who is not prepared by also being made holy and glorious himself or herself could not even stand upon the grass in the presence of a holy God, because the grass would be too solid, being glorified by God. It would hurt your feet. And I think that's an interesting thing. I've kind of enjoyed the idea over the last few years of the notion of how God's qualities get compared to a rock or a fire. And as a human, you can either be dashed upon the rock, that's what's going to happen to you if you live without reference to God, but if you live with reference to God, you set your foundation upon the rock. Or in the analogy of fire, if you live without reference to God, you're going to be consumed by the fire. But if you live with reference to God, if you center your life around Him, you're going to be purified by the fire. And the stuff that is kind of not worthy is going to be burned away, but the good things that God is putting into you will end up there. So you'll end up holy, you'll end up made pure, you'll end up with that kind of moral heft to your character to survive in this intense afterworld. But also, it's not just a spiritual thing, right? The third thing that we notice is that there's materiality, an embodiedness to the whole thing. And it's not an abstracted, merely spiritual city. There are streets to walk upon, there are walls to touch, to behold, to look at, to see things through, or to see reflections of, foundations to hold the whole edifice up. There are gems and jewels. In chapter 22, we're going to get into eating and drinking in this new experience. It's an embodied experience. Now the glory of God gives light and weight to the physical embodiedness of our existence and glorifies us. Now, I don't know what that means exactly. That sounds like a pretty slant telling, but it sounds exciting. We also see that there are peoples, plural. So the kings who submit to Christ bring their crowns and lay them at His feet. There's this notion that there are still the efforts of economy and culture and politics and other human pursuits. They continue, but now it's all purified, and it's no longer succumbing to the marks of the beast or of Babylon that we saw judged in chapters 18 through 20. Now human effort is glorified, and the things that we go to make become this worship experience and fully worship the God who made us. And so we see that there's creativity in this whole thing. And it all starts with God, but then it does flow through us as sub-creators within His creation. God is making all things new. Notice also that He's not making all new things. He's renewing and redeeming. And there's this renewing and redeeming work that continues in the new creation. Paul kind of hints at this notion that we're engaged in the action of sub-creation in 1 Corinthians 3. He describes how the things that we build in this life will be revealed to be of precious and eternal value, or things of only passing value that will be consumed in the fire of judgment. In the new creation, the making process for us continues, and we are participating. And then next week, we're going to look more at the presence of life and the face of God in chapter 22. So I wanted to pause there and ask you to consider another table talk question before we move towards wrapping up this text. I'm not the first person to notice that the Bible begins with humankind in a garden, but it ends with humankind in a city. So I want to pause here and give you a moment to think about this very slanty image. What's the difference between a garden and a city, and what significance is it that we end the Bible with a description of a glorified city? Throughout the Bible, cities are of kind of dubious value. They're often locales of evil. After Cain murders Abel, he ends up building the first city that we get mention of in the scriptures. And following this, cities are almost always places where the beast, representing human efforts to live without reference to God, takes root. You can think of Babylon, right? You can think of Sodom and Gomorrah. You can think how in Revelation, we've seen the system of the beast identified in Babylon and Rome, and even in Jerusalem, Old Jerusalem. But at the end here, we've arrived at the great reversal, the wonderful redemption of God, blown out to include All of our systems, our culture, our organization, our destiny is to live in the city of God and not in the city without reference to God, the city of sin. That place has been judged. It's gone into the lake of fire. Now, the most slanty part of this whole text to me is in verse 9, where we get the angel who's got one of the 7 bowls who comes and says to John, I'm going to show you the bride. Remember, we've already looked at her. She's in that train following Jesus, dressed in white linen. But then so what we look at when the angel shows John the bride is not the bride, but the place where the bride will dwell in this New Jerusalem. Now, there's a really intense metaphor that's going on here, and I want to take just a little bit of time to camp out on this to finish up. I hadn't made this connection yet until I was reading the commentaries this week about what's happening when the angel shows the bride, but then shows the place. So John's gospel spends the most time on Jesus' Passion Week out of any of the 4 Gospels, all the way from chapter 11 through to chapter 21 at the end of the book. John camps out in the last couple weeks around the crucifixion, focusing on Jesus' journey back to Jerusalem, the city where he knows he's going to die, the city. And we have this raising of Lazarus, we have the plotting of Judas and the Pharisees, we have Mary anointing Jesus' feet, we have the triumphal entry, and then in chapter 13, it slows down even further to focus on that last evening before Jesus is crucified, where we have the Last Supper and then some teachings that Jesus gives the disciples, and they go off to pray in the garden. At this meal, Jesus does a couple of truly spectacular things. He washes all of the disciples' feet. The King of Kings, making himself a servant to all who would put their trust in him, showing the scandalous truth of Christian hierarchy and the proper use of power. And Jesus then predicts Peter's betrayal. And after these moments, we know, by thinking through the evening's events, that Jesus institutes the sacrament of the Eucharist. And this is where I didn't see the link before. In Jewish culture, what would happen when a man would go to get married is he would go to the father of the groom, or of the bride, the groom would go to the father of the bride, and then they would negotiate about bride price, all the stuff that needs to be negotiated. And then they would make a covenant, which they would seal by drinking a cup of wine together, which would be kind of the ceremonial formalization, legalization of the agreement. After this, the groom would leave, for legally he is now married to the bride. But they haven't consummated the marriage yet. They haven't lived together. They haven't done any of that stuff. He goes away. We call it kind of engaged, but they're legally married. It's adultery if you break this covenant at this point. So the groom would go away, and he would prepare his home to receive his new bride. Now, this is probably the part of the sequence where Mary and Joseph was in this interim period when Mary experiences the Immaculate Conception, and then Joseph is like, what do I do now? I've got to try to save her reputation. It seems awful, but she's betrayed me. It's not good. But then Joseph receives the angel's instruction, and he goes through with getting married to Mary. So they're legally bound. They haven't consummated. This is why Joseph is in this moral quandary at that moment in the birth of Christ's story. So after an agreed upon time, then, often about a year, the groom would come back, and then they would have their wedding ceremony and feast, and then the groom would take the bride back to her new home with her new family, which was now him. So John doesn't relate the moment that Jesus creates the Eucharist. By the time John was writing his gospel, it had already been pretty well explored in Matthew's and Luke's gospels. But John does tell them of a teaching that Jesus gives right after they eat the bread and they drink the cup at the Last Supper. Jesus then tells the disciples that he's going away to prepare a home for them in his Father's house. The Last Supper is a wedding contract, right? Jesus seals the new covenant in his blood with the disciples by drinking the cup together with them. He had eagerly longed to drink that cup with them. And then he promises a new home for them. And then he goes away. To me, the part of this whole image that is so intense is that Jesus knows what a bunch of failures his guys are. John knows this too. At the Last Supper, John is probably still kind of thinking about how Jesus had rebuked him and his brother James for their efforts to try to figure out how to get to sit at the right and left hand of Jesus, which was a bloodier honor than they had realized it would be. Jesus predicts Peter's betrayal right there at the meal with everybody in full view of that. And yet Jesus commits to these guys. I'm making a covenant with you in my blood. I'm going to my death. You're all going to let me down, but I'm going to come back, and when I do, I'm going to bring down a city for you all to live in, a glorious city where the sin and brokenness that have defined too much of your lives here are no longer, and where my love and generosity now shapes everything that happens or will ever happen. That's what eternal life with Christ is all about. Just like how we are redeemed as individuals by getting right with Christ, the destiny for humankind is that we're going to see even the broken institutions like the cities redeemed, right? As God becomes our all in all and we find our place and purpose in him. The promise isn't for then only in the future, it's also for now. And we participate in this through taking communion. So, for your final table talk, I want you to find some elements to pray through communion with. So maybe some bread and some juice or something like that. I want you to think about the different slanty images that we've looked at today. The idea of the city being redeemed, God giving us the real city, the true city, big enough to contain all of faithful humankind. Maybe think about Christ committing to take you as part of his bride, knowing that you weren't going to live a perfect life, that you weren't holy, that you weren't worthy, but he still commits to you, to love you, and to take you to be part of his glorious new creation. Maybe you can think about Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, even as he knows that they're about to betray him. Maybe you can think about the removal of the curse, whatever other images you're thinking about from this text. And as you think about all of this, take your elements and thank Jesus for his love. Thank him for promising to come again. Thank him for the Holy Spirit as your comforter and sustainer in all that we face, and as we eagerly await the fullness of his kingdom come.